Captain William Bill Harrison vanished on March 15, 1945, while commanding a B-24 Liberator bomber on a reconnaissance mission over the vast Pacific Ocean. The experienced pilot had been leading his crew through the final, desperate months of World War II, when every flight carried the weight of history and the hope that each mission might be the last one needed to bring peace to the world. Bill Harrison was not just another name on the military roster. At 28 years old, he had already earned the respect of his squadron through 37 successful combat missions across the Pacific Theater. His weathered hands gripped the controls of Lady Liberty, the nickname his crew had given their faithful B-24, with the confidence of a man who understood both the power and fragility of the massive aircraft that carried them through hostile skies. The morning of March 15th began like countless others at the airbase on Guam. Harrison woke before dawn, as was his custom, in the cramped quarters he shared with fellow officers. The tropical heat was already building, promising another scorching day in the Marianas. He dressed methodically, checking his flight suit, adjusting his collar insignia, and ensuring his lucky compass was secured in his breast pocket, a gift from his wife Sarah that had accompanied him on every mission since arriving in the Pacific. In the mess hall, Harrison joined his crew for what would unknowingly be their final breakfast together. Technical Sergeant Robert Mac McCready, the aircraft's engineer, was already deep in conversation about the day's weather patterns with Navigator Lieutenant James Murphy. Radio operator Sergeant David Chen quietly reviewed communication frequencies, while Bombardier Lieutenant Thomas Anderson studied reconnaissance photos from previous flights over their assigned sector. The camaraderie among these men had been forged through months of shared danger and mutual dependence. They had weathered fierce storms together, dodged enemy fighters, and celebrated successful missions with the kind of bond that only forms when lives depend on absolute trust. Harrison had handpicked each member of his crew, recognizing not just their technical skills, but their character under pressure. As the squadron commander briefed the day's mission, Harrison listened with the focused attention that had kept him and his crew alive through nearly 40 combat sorties. Their assignment seemed routine by the standards of 1945, a reconnaissance flight over a sector of ocean where intelligence suggested possible enemy submarine activity. The mission would take them 600 miles northeast of Guam, over waters that had seen countless battles during the long Pacific campaign. What made this particular mission unique was its timing. Allied forces were already planning the invasion of Japan, and every piece of intelligence about enemy movements could prove crucial in the coming months. Harrison understood the weight of responsibility that came with these reconnaissance flights. The photographs and observations they gathered might influence strategic decisions that could save thousands of American lives. Back in his quarters before the mission, Harrison completed a ritual that had become sacred to him. He wrote a letter to Sarah, his wife of 4 years, who waited for him in their small apartment in Cleveland, Ohio. These letters had become lifelines connecting him to the world beyond war. Filled with dreams of the future they would build together once the conflict ended. In his final letter, found later among his personal effects, Harrison wrote about his hopes of returning home by Christmas and his excitement about starting the family they had long discussed. Sarah Harrison had married Bill just months before he shipped out to the Pacific. Their courtship had been a whirlwind romance typical of wartime, intense, passionate, and shadowed by the knowledge that their time together might be limited. She worked at a defense plant in Cleveland, contributing to the war effort while anxiously awaiting each letter from her husband. Her days were structured around the mail delivery, hoping for news that would confirm Bill's safety and bring them one day closer to his return. The Harrison family had a proud military tradition. Bill's father had served in the trenches of France during the Great War, returning home with stories that had both inspired and sobered his young son. When war came again, Bill felt the call to serve not as an obligation, but as a continuation of his family's commitment to defending freedom. His mother, Margaret, had watched 2 generations of men in her family march off to war, and she bore the weight of that knowledge with quiet dignity. On that March morning, as Harrison performed his pre-flight inspection of Lady Liberty, he moved with the methodical precision that had earned him his crew's unwavering confidence. Every instrument was checked, every system tested, every detail verified. The B-24 Liberator was a complex machine, requiring perfect coordination between its crew members to function effectively. Harrison had turned this coordination into an art form, leading his team through dangerous skies with a combination of technical skill and intuitive leadership. The weather briefing had indicated clear skies for most of their route, with possible afternoon thunderstorms in their return sector. Harrison had flown through Pacific storms before and knew how to navigate the towering cumulus clouds that could appear with little warning in these tropical waters. His crew trusted his judgment completely, having seen him guide them safely through conditions that had claimed other aircraft and crews. As the engines of Lady Liberty roared to life that morning, Harrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the beginning of each mission. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines synchronized their rhythm, creating the distinctive sound that had become the soundtrack of America's air war in the Pacific. Ground crew members gave final thumbs-up signals as the bomber taxied toward the runway, joining other aircraft preparing for various missions across the vast theater of operations. The takeoff was smooth, as Harrison had expected. Lady Liberty climbed steadily into the Pacific sky, her crew settling into the routine that had kept them alive through so many previous flights. Murphy plotted their course with practiced precision, while Chen established radio contact with base operations. McCready monitored engine performance, and Anderson prepared his photography equipment for the reconnaissance work that lay ahead. What none of them could have anticipated was that this routine mission would become anything but routine. As Lady Liberty disappeared into the morning haze, heading northeast toward their assigned reconnaissance sector, they were beginning a journey that would end in mystery and silence. The vast Pacific Ocean, which had already claimed so many aircraft and crews during the Long War, was about to claim another victim, in circumstances that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. The families back home continued their daily routines, unaware that this particular morning would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt them for 50 years. Sarah Harrison went to work at the defense plant, carrying Bill's latest letter in her purse and counting the days until his next correspondence would arrive. Margaret Harrison tended her victory garden and listened to war news on the radio, praying for her son's safety as she had done every day since he deployed to the Pacific. In the months that followed, as search operations failed to locate any trace of Lady Liberty or her crew, these families would join the ranks of countless others who waited for news that would never come, holding on to hope even as official channels declared their loved ones missing in action. The war would end, victory would be celebrated, and life would continue, but the mystery of what happened to Captain William Harrison and his crew would remain unsolved, buried somewhere in the vast expanses of the Pacific Theater, where so many heroes had made their final sacrifice for freedom. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came at 15:47 hours, when Lady Liberty failed to make her scheduled radio check-in with Guam Control Tower. Captain Harrison had been meticulous about communication protocols throughout his combat career, never missing a scheduled contact without prior notification. Radio operator Sergeant Chen's voice, which should have crackled through the speakers with their position report and status update, remained silent across the airwaves of the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sterling, the squadron operations officer, initially attributed the silence to routine radio difficulties. Pacific weather could interfere with communications, and equipment failures were not uncommon in the harsh tropical environment. However, as the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2 hours beyond the missed check-in time, a growing sense of unease settled over the operations center at the Guam Air Base. By 1800 hours, when Lady Liberty should have been beginning her return approach to Guam, the silence had transformed from concerning to alarming. Sterling ordered all available radio operators to attempt contact on emergency frequencies, broadcasting calls that echoed across the empty Pacific sky without response. The vast ocean that surrounded their island base suddenly seemed more threatening, its endless expanse now hiding the fate of 5 American airmen. The search operation began immediately, despite the approaching darkness that would limit visibility. Every available aircraft was pressed into service, their crews volunteering without hesitation to scour the waters along Lady Liberty's planned flight path. B-25. Mitchell bombers flew low over the waves, their crews scanning the surface for any sign of wreckage, oil slicks or life rafts that might indicate where their fellow airmen had gone down. Flight Lieutenant Patricia Morgan, one of the few women serving in communications at the Guam base, had been monitoring radio frequencies since the first missed check-in. She knew Harrison's crew personally, having processed their flight plans and communications for months. As the hours passed without any contact, she felt the weight of helplessness that came with being unable to reach out across the vast Pacific to offer assistance to men who might be fighting for their lives somewhere in the darkness. The search intensified at dawn on March 16th, with aircraft from multiple bases joining the effort to locate Lady Liberty. Navy vessels in the area were diverted to assist, their radar operators sweeping the ocean surface while lookouts strained their eyes against the glare of the tropical sun. The search pattern covered hundreds of square miles, expanding outward from Harrison's last known position, like ripples on a pond. Back in Cleveland, Sarah Harrison went about her morning routine unaware that her husband's aircraft was missing. She arrived at the defense plant expecting another normal day of war production work, chatting with her colleagues about rationing recipes and sharing the latest letters from their husbands overseas. The telegram that would change her life forever was still hours away from being composed, as military protocol required exhaustive search efforts before families were notified of missing personnel. Margaret Harrison tended her victory garden that morning, pulling weeds and checking the progress of her tomatoes, while listening to war news on her portable radio. The broadcaster spoke of Allied advances in Europe and the continuing push toward Japan, but made no mention of the 5-man crew that had vanished somewhere in the Pacific. She paused in her work to offer a silent prayer for her son's safety, a daily ritual that had sustained her through nearly 2 years of his Pacific deployment. The search aircraft returned to base that evening with nothing to report. Hundreds of hours of flight time had yielded no trace of Lady Liberty or her crew. The ocean had swallowed them completely, leaving no debris field, no oil slick, no emergency signals to mark their passage. It was as if the massive B-24 Liberator had simply vanished into thin air, taking 5 experienced airmen with it into the mystery of the Pacific. On March 18th, 3 days after the disappearance, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling faced the grim task of composing the official telegrams that would inform the families. The words came slowly, each phrase carefully chosen to convey the severity of the situation while maintaining hope for the ongoing search efforts. The telegram to Sarah Harrison was brief and devastating in its military precision. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Captain William Harrison, has been reported missing in action in the Pacific area since 15th and March 1945. The Western Union messenger who delivered the telegram to Sarah's apartment found her preparing dinner and humming a popular song from the radio. The young man had delivered too many such messages during the war years, and he recognized the look of dawning horror that crossed her face as she read the official notification. Sarah's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair, the yellow paper trembling in her hands as the reality of Bill's disappearance crashed over her like a cold wave. Margaret Harrison received her telegram while working in the garden, her hands still covered with soil when the messenger called her to the front door. She read the message twice, her lips moving silently as she processed each word, before carefully folding the paper and placing it in her apron pocket. Neighbors later recalled seeing her standing motionless among her tomato plants for nearly an hour, staring toward the horizon as if she could somehow see across the continent and ocean to where her son had vanished. The search operation continued for 2 weeks, expanding to cover nearly 10,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean. Coast Guard cutters joined Navy destroyers in sweeping search patterns, while aircraft from multiple Allied bases maintained constant patrols over the search area. The massive effort involved hundreds of personnel and dozens of aircraft, representing one of the most extensive search operations mounted for a single missing bomber crew during the Pacific Campaign. Technical Sergeant McCready's wife, Helen, received the news at their home near Seattle, where she was caring for their 6-month-old daughter. The baby had been born just weeks before Mac deployed to the Pacific, and his letters home were filled with joy about becoming a father and plans for their life together after the war. Helen held their daughter close as she read the telegram, wondering if the child would ever know the gentle, mechanically minded man who had written such loving letters from across the ocean. Lieutenant Murphy's parents, Irish immigrants who had settled in Boston, received their notification at the small grocery store they operated in a working-class neighborhood. James had been their pride and joy, the first in their family to attend college and earn a commission as an officer. His father, Patrick Murphy, closed the store early that day and walked to their parish church, where he lit a candle and prayed for his son's safe return from whatever fate had befallen him in the Pacific. Radio operator Sergeant Chen's family in San Francisco's Chinatown faced additional challenges beyond the grief of his disappearance. David had been fighting two wars, one against the Japanese in the Pacific, and another against the prejudice and suspicion that Chinese-American families faced on the home front during the conflict. His parents, who had immigrated from Canton decades earlier, struggled to navigate the military bureaucracy while dealing with neighbors who sometimes questioned their loyalty despite having a son serving in combat. Bombardier Lieutenant Anderson's young wife, Mary, was 7 months pregnant with their first child when the telegram arrived at their small apartment in rural Kansas. Tommy had been thrilled about becoming a father and had filled his letters with plans for teaching their child to fish in the creek where he had grown up. Mary found herself facing the prospect of raising their baby alone, uncertain whether she was a widow or still a wife to a man who might somehow, somewhere, still be alive. The official search was scaled back after 2 weeks, though patrol aircraft continued to watch for any signs of the missing crew during routine missions over the area. The Pacific had claimed countless aircraft during the war years, and Lady Liberty's disappearance, while tragic, was not unprecedented. However, the complete absence of any wreckage or distress signals made this case particularly puzzling to the search coordinators. At the Guam Air Base, Harrison's squadron mates struggled with the loss of their respected leader and friends. The empty bunks in the officers' quarters served as daily reminders of the 5 men who had simply vanished during what should have been a routine reconnaissance flight. New crews arrived to replace the missing airmen, but the mystery of Lady Liberty's disappearance cast a shadow over squadron operations. Flight Lieutenant Morgan continued monitoring radio frequencies for weeks after the official search ended, hoping against hope that Chen's distinctive voice might somehow break through the static, with word that the crew had survived on some uncharted island. She knew the vast Pacific contained hundreds of small atolls and coral islands that might not appear on standard navigation charts, and she clung to the possibility that Harrison's exceptional flying skills had somehow brought his crew to safety in an unmapped location. The families entered a painful period of uncertainty that would stretch across months and years. Unlike those who received confirmation of their loved one's fate, the families of Lady Liberty's crew faced the agonizing limbo of not knowing whether to grieve or continue hoping. Military regulations classified the men as missing in action rather than deceased, a distinction that provided little comfort but maintained official uncertainty about their status. Sarah Harrison found herself unable to remove Bill's clothes from their shared closet or pack away his personal belongings. Their apartment became a shrine to their interrupted life together, with his coffee cup still sitting beside hers in the kitchen cabinet, and his favorite chair remaining empty by the radio, where they used to listen to evening programs together. She continued writing letters to him for months, sealing them in envelopes that accumulated in her desk drawer like prayers written to someone who might never read them. The war in the Pacific continued around the mystery of the missing bomber, with Allied forces pressing their advantage toward the Japanese home islands. Other crews flew missions over the same waters where Lady Liberty had vanished, their radio operators calling out position reports that crackled clearly across the airwaves, making the silence from Harrison's crew even more profound by comparison. Victory in the Pacific was approaching, but it would arrive without 5 airmen who had given their lives in service to that cause. As months passed without any trace of the missing aircraft, the initial intense focus on the disappearance began to fade, replaced by the countless other tragedies and triumphs of the continuing war effort. However, for the families left behind, the mystery of what had happened to their loved ones on that clear March morning over the Pacific Ocean would define the rest of their lives, leaving them forever searching the horizon for answers that seemed as vast and unreachable as the ocean itself. The victory celebrations that swept across America in August 1945 carried a bittersweet quality for the families of Lady Liberty's crew. While millions rejoiced at the end of the devastating world conflict, Sarah Harrison found herself standing at her apartment window, watching the jubilant crowds in Cleveland streets while clutching the last letter Bill had written before his disappearance. The war was over, but for her, the waiting had only begun. Margaret Harrison attended the local victory parade, pinning her son's service ribbons to her coat and carrying a small photograph of Bill in his pilot's uniform. Neighbors offered their congratulations and condolences in the same breath, unsure how to acknowledge both the triumph of Allied victory and the ongoing mystery of her missing son. She smiled graciously and thanked them, but privately wondered if Bill had lived to see the victory he had fought so hard to achieve. The military's post-war bureaucracy proved frustratingly slow in addressing cases of personnel who remained missing in action. Lady Liberty's crew joined thousands of other service members whose fates remained unknown, their files transferred from active investigation to administrative limbo. The massive demobilization effort took precedence over resolving individual cases, leaving families to navigate complex paperwork procedures while seeking any scrap of information about their missing loved ones. Helen McCready faced unique challenges as a young mother, trying to rebuild her life, without knowing whether she was a widow or a wife. Baby Patricia grew from an infant who would never know her father into a toddler who asked increasingly difficult questions about the man in the photographs on their mantelpiece. Helen struggled with how to explain to a 3-year-old that Daddy had gone away on an airplane and might never come home, choosing instead to speak of him as if his return was merely delayed rather than possibly permanent. In Boston, Patrick and Bridget Murphy converted their son James's bedroom into a shrine to his memory, preserving his college textbooks, navigation instruments, and the letters he had sent home from the Pacific. They continued operating their small grocery store, but neighbors noticed how Patrick would pause in his work whenever aircraft flew overhead, his eyes following their path across the Massachusetts sky, as if searching for some sign of his missing son among the peacetime flights. The Chen family in San Francisco faced additional hardships during the post-war period. David's parents, who had endured suspicion and hostility during the war despite their son's service, found themselves struggling to access military benefits and information about his status. Language barriers and cultural misunderstandings complicated their interactions with military bureaucracy, while the Chinese-American community rallied around them with support that the broader society sometimes failed to provide. Mary Anderson gave birth to her son Thomas Jr. in May 1945, 2 months after her husband's disappearance. The boy grew up surrounded by stories of the father he would never meet, with Mary carefully preserving every letter, photograph, and memento from Tommy's brief life. She never remarried, dedicating herself to raising their son and keeping alive the memory of the young bombardier who had vanished over the Pacific before learning he was about to become a father. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the families gradually established new routines while maintaining hope for resolution. Sarah Harrison eventually returned to work, finding purpose in helping other military families navigate the complex systems of benefits and support. She became an unofficial advocate for families of missing service members, using her experience to guide others through the bureaucratic maze while never abandoning hope for news about Bill's fate. The military conducted periodic reviews of missing personnel cases, but Lady Liberty's disappearance proved particularly challenging to investigate. Unlike aircraft that crashed in known combat zones or left identifiable wreckage, Harrison's bomber had simply vanished without a trace over open ocean. The search area was vast, the ocean depths largely unexplored, and the passage of time made any potential discovery increasingly unlikely. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling, who had coordinated the original search effort, retired from active duty, but maintained correspondence with the families throughout the 1950s. He provided what information he could about ongoing efforts to account for missing personnel, though he privately acknowledged that the chances of solving Lady Liberty's mystery grew smaller with each passing year. The Pacific had kept its secret well, offering no clues to the fate of the 5 airmen who had disappeared into its vastness. Young Patricia McCready began school in the early 1950s, facing the challenge of explaining to classmates why she had no father at home. Helen had taught her daughter to say that Daddy was away on a very long trip, but the girl's natural curiosity led to increasingly complex questions about when he might return. Other military families understood the situation, but civilian friends often struggled to comprehend the ongoing uncertainty that defined their lives. The 1960s brought renewed interest in accounting for missing service members, as public awareness grew about the need to resolve World War II cases that had remained open for decades. The military established new investigation units specifically tasked with researching missing personnel files, using improved record-keeping systems and emerging technologies to re-examine cold cases. Lady Liberty's disappearance received fresh attention, But investigators found the same lack of physical evidence that had frustrated their predecessors. Thomas Anderson Jr. grew into adolescence during the Vietnam era, when military service carried different connotations than it had during his father's time. He struggled with questions about following in his father's footsteps, particularly given the uncertain fate that had befallen Tommy Sr. Mary encouraged her son to make his own choices about military service, though she privately feared the possibility of losing another Anderson man to the dangers of military aviation. Sarah Harrison never remarried, despite receiving several proposals from suitors who admired her dedication and strength. She maintained their Cleveland apartment much as Bill had left it, changing only what necessity demanded as she aged. Friends and family members eventually stopped suggesting that she move on with her life, recognizing that her vigil for Bill's return had become as fundamental to her identity as breathing. The advancing years brought technological developments that offered new hope for resolving old mysteries. Improved sonar equipment and deeper diving submarines made it theoretically possible to search ocean areas that had been inaccessible in 1945. However, the vast scope of the Pacific search area and the enormous cost of deep-sea operations meant that most resources were directed toward cases with more specific location information. Margaret Harrison lived to see her 80th birthday in 1967, still maintaining the victory garden she had planted during the war, and continuing to pray daily for her son's safe return. She passed away peacefully that winter, never learning what had happened to Bill, but never losing faith that he had died serving his country with honor. Her funeral was attended by many of the neighborhood families whose own sons had returned from the war, creating a community of shared memory around those who had and had not come home. The 1970s brought a new generation of researchers and investigators to the task of accounting for missing military personnel. Fresh eyes examined old files, and emerging computer systems made it possible to cross-reference information in ways that had been impossible decades earlier. Lady Liberty's case received renewed scrutiny, with investigators mapping ocean currents, weather patterns, and known aircraft performance characteristics to develop new theories about what might have happened to Harrison's crew. Helen McCready remarried in 1975, 30 years after Mac's disappearance, choosing a kind widower who understood her need to maintain her first husband's memory while building a new life. Patricia, now a mother herself, supported her mother's decision while ensuring that her children learned about the grandfather they would never meet. The McCready family tradition of mechanical expertise lived on through Patricia's sons, who showed the same aptitude for understanding complex machinery that had made their grandfather such a valued crew member. The Chen family's grocery business in Chinatown became a gathering place for other Chinese-American families who had lost relatives during the war. David's parents, now elderly, shared stories with younger generations about their son's service and sacrifice, helping to preserve the memory of Chinese-American contributions to the war effort. The community honored David and others like him with memorial plaques and annual remembrance ceremonies that acknowledged their dual heritage and singular dedication. As the 1980s arrived, the families of Lady Liberty's crew found themselves part of a larger movement seeking resolution for thousands of cases of missing service members from multiple conflicts. New legislation provided additional resources for investigation efforts, though the practical challenges of searching vast ocean areas remained formidable. Advanced satellite imaging and improved mapping technologies offered theoretical possibilities for discovery, but the Pacific continued to guard its secrets. The passage of 4 decades had transformed the urgent mystery of 1945 into historical curiosity for most of the public, but for the families involved, the questions remained as immediate and painful as ever. Sarah Harrison, now in her 70s, maintained detailed correspondence with military investigators and other families of missing personnel, sharing information and supporting each other through the long years of uncertainty. Young Thomas Anderson Jr. ultimately chose a career in civilian aviation, becoming a commercial airline pilot, while honoring his father's memory through skilled and safe flying. He married and had children of his own, ensuring that the Anderson family name would continue, despite the loss of his father. Mary lived to see her grandchildren learn about their grandfather's service, carrying forward the stories of the bombardier who had vanished before his son was born. The 1990s brought new technological capabilities and renewed political commitment to resolving cases of missing service members. Advanced deep-sea exploration equipment made it possible to search ocean areas that had been completely inaccessible in previous decades. However, the sheer vastness of the Pacific search area meant that even the most sophisticated equipment could spend years searching without covering more than a tiny fraction of the possible crash sites. By the early 1990s, 5 decades had passed since Lady Liberty's disappearance, transforming the case from active investigation to historical research. Most of the original searchers had passed away, along with many of the family members who had waited so long for answers. The military files contained thousands of pages of reports, theories, and correspondence, but no definitive answers about what had happened to Captain Harrison and his crew on that clear March morning over the Pacific. Patricia McReady, now a grandmother herself, became the family's primary keeper of her father's memory, maintaining his photographs, medals, and letters, while ensuring that her children and grandchildren understood the sacrifice he had made. She participated in military family organizations and memorial services, finding strength in the community of others who shared similar experiences of loss and uncertainty. The families had adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience, building meaningful lives while carrying the permanent absence of their missing loved ones. They had learned to live with unanswered questions, finding ways to honor their relatives' memory, while accepting that some mysteries might never be solved. Yet even after 50 years, none of them had completely abandoned hope that someday, somehow, the Pacific might finally reveal what had happened to the 5 airmen who had vanished into its endless expanse, taking with them the dreams and hopes of the families who still waited for their return. Dr. Michael Harrison, grandson of the missing Captain William Harrison, never imagined that his botanical expedition to the remote jungles of Papua New Guinea in 1995 would finally solve the 50-year-old mystery that had defined his family's history. The young botanist had grown up listening to his grandmother Sarah's stories about his grandfather's disappearance, but he had chosen his scientific career path for reasons entirely unrelated to the family's wartime tragedy. The expedition team, consisting of 6 researchers from various universities, had been mapping previously unexplored regions of the Papua New Guinea highlands for 3 weeks when their local guide, an elderly man named Kaimana, mentioned something unusual he had discovered decades earlier while hunting in the deeper jungle areas. Through broken English and gestures, he described what sounded like a big bird made of metal, hidden beneath the thick canopy, covered by 50 years of tropical growth. Initially skeptical, Dr. Harrison and his colleague Dr. Rebecca Chen, a specialist in Pacific ecosystems whose grandfather had coincidentally served in the same theater during World War II, decided to investigate Kaimana's claim. The guide led them through nearly impenetrable jungle terrain for 2 days, following paths that existed more in his memory than on the ground, until they reached a section of forest that seemed different from the surrounding areas. What they discovered on March 15, 1995, exactly 50 years after Lady Liberty's disappearance, defied explanation and sent shockwaves through both the scientific and military communities. Partially buried under 5 decades of jungle growth, its aluminum skin dulled but remarkably intact, sat a B-24 Liberator bomber. The aircraft had somehow survived its crash landing in the dense jungle, protected from the elements by the thick canopy overhead, and preserved by the unique atmospheric conditions of the highland rainforest. The bomber rested in a small clearing that had apparently been created by its impact, with massive trees having grown around and through portions of the aircraft over the intervening decades. Vines and moss covered much of the fuselage, but the distinctive shape and markings were unmistakably those of an American World War II heavy bomber. Most remarkably, the aircraft appeared to be largely intact, suggesting that Captain Harrison had managed to execute an emergency landing that had kept the plane from disintegrating on impact. Dr. Harrison's hands trembled as he approached the wreckage, recognizing the tail number that matched the aircraft described in his grandmother's letters and military records. The name Lady Liberty was still partially visible on the nose, painted letters faded but readable beneath decades of jungle growth. This was undoubtedly his grandfather's bomber, the aircraft that had vanished without a trace and left 5 families waiting for answers that had never come. The expedition team immediately contacted authorities through their satellite communication equipment, initiating a complex international process involving the Papua New Guinea government, American military representatives, and forensic specialists. Within days, the remote jungle site became the focus of intense activity as investigators from multiple agencies arrived to examine the remarkable discovery and search for evidence about the crew's fate. Initial examination of the aircraft revealed that Captain Harrison had indeed managed a controlled emergency landing, bringing Lady Liberty down in the jungle with minimal structural damage. The landing gear had been retracted, and the flaps were extended, indicating that Harrison had followed proper emergency procedures, despite whatever crisis had forced him to attempt a landing in the dense rainforest. His exceptional flying skills had saved the aircraft from complete destruction, though the ultimate fate of the crew remained unclear. Inside the bomber, investigators found a treasure trove of preserved artifacts that painted a vivid picture of the crew's final hours. The tropical climate had damaged some materials, but many items remained remarkably well preserved, including flight logs, personal letters, photographs, and equipment that provided crucial clues about what had happened during Lady Liberty's final mission over the Pacific. Navigator Lieutenant Murphy's charts and plotting instruments were found at his station, with course corrections marked right up until the time of the emergency landing. The final entries showed that the aircraft had been blown significantly off course by unexpected weather patterns, carrying them hundreds of miles from their intended flight path and into the mountainous jungle region where they had ultimately crashed. Radio equipment damage, evident from scattered components throughout the aircraft, explained why Sergeant Chen had been unable to transmit distress calls. The discovery of personal items belonging to each crew member provided heartbreaking glimpses into their lives and hopes. Technical Sergeant McCready's toolkit was found alongside photographs of his wife Helen and baby daughter Patricia, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Lieutenant Anderson's bombardier equipment was positioned near letters from his pregnant wife Mary, including one announcing that she was expecting their first child. Most poignantly, investigators found Captain Harrison's final letter to his wife Sarah, begun during the flight but never completed. The unfinished correspondence described routine mission details and expressed his usual optimism about returning home safely, cutting off mid-sentence at what must have been the moment when the emergency began. His lucky compass, the gift from Sarah that had accompanied him on every mission, was found still secured in his uniform pocket. The aircraft's condition and the positioning of equipment suggested that the crew had survived the initial crash landing and had attempted to establish some form of temporary shelter while planning their next course of action. Evidence indicated they had tried to repair the radio equipment and had organized their supplies, suggesting they had hope for either rescue or self-rescue from their jungle predicament. However, the remote location and thick jungle canopy made it impossible for search aircraft in 1945 to spot the downed bomber, even if they had been looking in the correct area. The crew's survival would have depended on their ability to navigate through hundreds of miles of some of the world's most challenging terrain to reach civilization, a task that would have tested even the most experienced jungle survival experts. Forensic examination of the site provided additional clues about the crew's fate. Evidence suggested they had remained with the aircraft for several days, possibly weeks, before making the decision to attempt reaching help on foot. Personal items found at various distances from the crash site indicated that the crew had initially stayed together, following established survival protocols for downed aircrew in hostile territory. The investigation team, led by military forensic specialists and anthropologists, worked methodically to document every aspect of the discovery. Each item was carefully cataloged and preserved, creating a comprehensive record of the crew's final mission and the circumstances of their disappearance. The work was painstaking, requiring weeks of careful excavation and documentation in the challenging jungle environment. News of the discovery reached the families through official military channels, bringing a mixture of closure and renewed grief after 50 years of uncertainty. Sarah Harrison, now 83 years old and living in a Cleveland nursing home, received the news with remarkable composure, telling the notification officer that she had always known Bill would be found someday. Her faith in her husband's abilities as a pilot had been vindicated by evidence of his successful emergency landing under impossible conditions. Patricia McCready, now a grandmother herself, traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with military officials and learn about her father's final mission. Seeing his preserved tools and the photographs he had carried of her as a baby provided a connection to the father she had never known, finally answering questions that had shaped her entire life. The discovery confirmed that Mac had been thinking of his family, even in the aircraft's final moments. Thomas Anderson, Jr., the son who had grown up without ever meeting his father, found particular meaning in learning about his father's survival efforts and the letters from his mother that Tommy Sr. had carefully preserved. The knowledge that his father had tried so hard to return home to witness his birth provided a sense of connection that had been missing throughout his life. The Chen family, now scattered across several states, gathered together for the first time in decades to honor their relative's memory and learn about his final service. David's preserved radio equipment told the story of his desperate attempts to re-establish communication with base, trying until the very end to fulfill his duty as the crew's link to the outside world. Military ceremony planners worked with the families to design appropriate memorial services that would honor both the crew's service and their remarkable survival efforts. The discovery had transformed Lady Liberty's story from a simple wartime disappearance into an epic of courage, skill, and determination that exemplified the best qualities of the greatest generation. The aircraft itself presented complex challenges for preservation and potential recovery. The remote location and the jungle's 50-year claim on the bomber made extraction extremely difficult and expensive. After extensive consultation with the families and military historians, the decision was made to preserve the site as a memorial, with select artifacts being carefully removed for display in military museums, while the aircraft remained in its jungle resting place. Dr. Michael Harrison's botanical expedition had accidentally solved one of World War II's most enduring mysteries, providing answers that had eluded investigators for half a century. His discovery brought closure to 5 families, while adding a remarkable chapter to the history of American military service in the Pacific. The young botanist had given his family a gift that his grandmother Sarah had waited an entire lifetime to receive. The revelation that Captain Harrison and his crew had survived their aircraft's disappearance, at least initially, transformed their story from one of tragic loss into one of extraordinary courage and survival skills. Their final resting place in the Papua New Guinea jungle became a testament to their dedication, their brotherhood, and their determination to return home to the families who had never stopped waiting for them. Sarah Harrison passed away peacefully 6 months after learning of the discovery, finally able to lay to rest the questions that had defined her life for 50 years. Her funeral was attended by descendants of all 5 crew members, creating a gathering that honored not only her memory but the bonds forged between families by shared loss and eventual understanding. The mystery of Lady Liberty had finally been solved, revealing a story of skill, courage, and sacrifice that honored both the crew's service and their families' long vigil. In the heart of the Papua New Guinea jungle, beneath a canopy of green that had protected their secret for half a century, 5 American heroes had found their final resting place, their story preserved forever in the memories of those who loved them and the history of a nation they had served with honor.